Hi, students. Well, I hope everybody's getting settled into the class and that you have been able to order your Rebel textbook, that you've had a chance to look over the syllabus and are really comfortable with getting started with the course. We're going to move right into our first discussion today of what is sociology. The perfect starting point for a sociology class, of course, is to be able to really have a good understanding and definition of what the concept of sociology is. I will say that sociology is in many ways difficult to define. I wish I could easily do it in a brief amount of time, but defining sociology could really be a full hour or two discussion. It is a discipline that encompasses so much, everything from the construction of theory to modeling concepts and ideas of social change. Sociology does a lot. So we're going to begin today by taking on the idea or the question of what is sociology. And I want to begin by quoting C. Wright Mills, who says that whatever sociology may be, it is the result of constantly asking the question, what is the meaning of this? C. Wright Mills was a very important early sociologist, early American sociologist who was very well known for some writings that he did in the 1950s. And we'll be talking about him later and the construction of his concept called the sociological imagination. But C. Wright Mills gives us this very important way of thinking about what sociology is. What sociology is. Sociology is about questioning the world around you, about constantly thinking about what's the meaning of this? How do I explain this? How do I understand this? If we really want to think about what sociology is in practical ways, and then I'll give you the more formal definition, I like to think of a couple of ideas. First, sociology is asking difficult questions. Sociologists are not afraid to ask the questions that really challenge a society, challenge its members. Sociology is about questioning the taken for granted and thinking about what are the things that we do every day in our life that we start to consider normal or that we don't even think about. Sociology is also about making the unseen seen. Sociologists want us to say, you know what, there are things that are going on in our society, and oftentimes we choose to ignore them in some ways, or we choose to keep them invisible. How is it that we bring these things to light, that we problematize them? And then lastly, we can say that um, enlightening people about the complicated workings of a society is also a big part of what sociologists do. When we ask difficult questions, we are challenging people to think about the things in a society that are hard to deal with. When we ask questions of why is there poverty, for example, why do we see more groups incarcerated than other groups? Why do we see gender disparities in wages when people have similar, if not equal, levels of education and training? These are the difficult questions that sociologists ask and answer. When we question the taken for granted, we look at the little things that we do each and every day. For example, when we get in a car and drive someplace and we take it for granted that everybody knows the rules of the road, for example. We take it for granted that everyone kind of knows the language and knows how to interpret things. But when we start to question what happens to a social interaction when people no longer take things for granted, but when people start to question each and every aspect of that interaction. How does it change? And how do we understand meaning differently? When we make the unseen seen, we begin to, once again, look at the things that we know are there, but now we problematize them. When we talk about issues such as race, racial inequality, class and class inequality, we see poverty on the streets every day. We see homeless people all the time. Sociologists make the unseen seen. We start to ask questions of why is this? Who says this is okay? Is this a problem? Why is it a problem? When did it become a problem? We take the unseen, the things that occur that people tend to ignore, and we make them seen. And hopefully all of this is done through a process of knowing that we always want to enlighten people about the complicated workings of a society. And hopefully through sociology, people learn more about the way their social world works. But I'll also give you 4 aspects of the definition of sociology that I definitely want you to have under your heading of notes of what is sociology, because these are important. First of all, we would say that sociology is the study of human behavior in society, that sociologists are interested in understanding the individual, but in the context of the larger society. It's very important from the beginning that we understand that sociologists are not psychologists. Sociologists are really not interested in individuals or the individual psyche or individual behavior as isolated from the larger society. Sociologists want to know how human behavior is impacted by the actions of others around them, by the society that we live in. Sociologists are very much interested in the individual, but the individual in relation to the larger social structure. And we'll spend a lot more time talking about that, but that's very important as a starting point. So that leads to the second point, the study of how individual behavior is shaped by social groups. Sociologists are, once again, interested in the individual, but in the context of larger social groups and settings that we participate in. For example, the family, the educational system, the economy, peer groups. All of these groups influence individual behavior. So sociologists are interested in studying those groups, the dynamics of those groups, what takes place in them, what do we learn, what are the functions or goals of these different groups. What do they do to our society? What do they do for our society? What do they do for individuals? Why do we need them? Why do we use them? Why do we rely on them? We also like to say that sociology is a science. It's a scientific way to think about society and its influence on people. We stress the word science for a couple of reasons. First of all, we don't want to assume that sociology is taken for granted knowledge in any way, but that sociology builds on a plethora of research, a body of literature, and that sociologists are constantly in the process of building that body of literature through creating research and doing research. And this research is done using this process that we call the scientific method, which we'll talk more about in a couple of lectures. So sociology is seen as science because the ideas aren't just assumptions. They aren't based on the taken for granted world that we live in every day, but sociology is rooted in research and evidence. We also say that sociology is the study of the development, the organization, and the functioning of a society. Of course, sociologists are very interested in knowing what makes our society tick. How is it organized? What are all of the different parts that are involved in the makings and the workings of a society? How are these parts organized? What do they do? How are they developed and changed over time? So once again, we spend a lot of time in this course talking about different aspects of social organization. We talk about a number of different social institutions, such as the educational system and the economy. And we look at the way that all of these different pieces come together to help us understand how a society is organized. And lastly, sociology is a study of social change. If there's one thing we know, it's that societies don't stay the same, but that they change over time. Change can be very, very gradual over 200 or 300 years. Change can be very quick when we talk about, for example, social movements and movements that are about perhaps building a fair and more just social system for particular groups. We can even talk about forms of collective action where people come together to ask for and demand change immediately and oftentimes receive it. So there's lots of ways that sociology can focus on this idea of social change, whether it's long-term gradual change, which we'll talk about, changes in economies, changes in cultures, or whether it's change that's brought about through collective action, social activism, and social movements. These are all things that sociologists are interested in. So these 5 aspects can help us understand what sociology is and can provide us a solid basis for having a definition of sociology. In our next lecture, we'll start thinking about this thing that we call society. We'll define it and start moving into understanding how sociologists study it.